welcome to this episode of the Innovation Circuit with Theta. I'm Liz Knight, Theta's Head of Cybersecurity. In this episode, I'm joined by lead consultant from our Data and Insights team, Gregg Taylor. We're going to be discussing how to ensure your organization's sensitive data remains safe and secure, leveraging Microsoft Purview. Theta started on our data protection journey a few years ago with the formation of our data governance group, headed up by our Head of Digital and Data, Gary Blumgard. We had started looking at our data estate, trying to understand where our data was located and what type of data we had with the plan to classify it. But that all fast-tracked with the advent of Microsoft 365 Copilot. Overnight, we were faced with the possibility that Copilot could query across all of our Microsoft 365 files in email, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and we, along with all of our customers, suddenly faced with the daunting task of ensuring all of our confidential and sensitive data remains safe and secure. We since completed a Copilot readiness assessment and deployed Purview data protection. We've also helped a number of customers get this set up and have learned some great lessons along the way, which makes this a perfect time for us to share what we've learned on the sometimes windy and bumpy road to securing data in the modern age of AI. As an organisation, we were super excited to get started with Microsoft Copilot, but in my role as Head of Security, I definitely had some apprehension alongside the excitement. We've developed a Copilot readiness assessment offering to deliver to our customers, so it made sense that we ran that across Theta internal to understand our gaps. One of the critical recommendations resulting from the assessment was that we needed to formally implement data sensitivity labeling. Before we get started, what actually is data sensitivity labeling, Greg? Like visually, it's a label on a document to advise whether the document is confidential or public, but what's actually going on behind the scenes?
So when we implement the sensitivity labeling, it's a feature of Purview where we using one of the components of Purview called information protection. Now, what this will do is it will start looking at all the files in your organization, and it will scan them, and it will look at the contents of them, or to be manually done by a user. And what you're all going to do is you're going to add an extra part to the metadata of that file, which is then going to highlight what type of information is in this. So depending on how you classify that data in your file, we want to enhance the metadata against that file, add a label to it, and then what we can do once you've got a label attached to an Office document, it can be Excel or Word or an email, once there's a label associated with that, we can start applying policies to that and saying, we want to encrypt this file because of the type of data that's in there, or we want to restrict someone from emailing this file out. And then that also leads to, once having that sort of control over your data, you can do access control. It also allows us to start implementing additional solutions like data loss protection, which is going to allow you to control again what data is going where, all based on what kind of information stored in that file, all brought to the forefront by that sensitivity label. It will sort of feed into other parts of Purview. So specifically, we could be looking in this scenario that we've got with Copilot, we can actually enforce or that Copilot only accesses particular parts of data in our organization, depending what label is applied to that. So we're not only just doing it for a governance perspective where we can see, okay, this is the type of information we have, we're also doing it from a data protection point of view where we ensure that Copilot is not going to retrieve information from a confidential file and sort of expose that to someone else externally, or expose it to someone that won't necessarily know that this information is confidential and that they shouldn't be sharing it out to the organization.
Yeah, exactly. What kind of drivers are you seeing for customers getting started on this data classification journey?
Well, recently we've had the Copilot readiness check that we're doing, but many organizations, because they're all adopting AI, and if we are a Microsoft organization and we've got our Azure tenant, many are considering the Copilot route for AI. And we want to, like I said earlier, ensure that Copilot isn't going to access or expose data in an organization that it shouldn't be doing. For some reason, I've got a file hidden somewhere in SharePoint that a user is not aware of, and we've got no classification on it, and it had employee salaries or anything like that in there, and it's lost in SharePoint, because you know we can lose files in SharePoint all the time. If we have a label on it, Copilot will not access that information. But if we don't have the labels on it and that user has access to that file for whatever reason, that user is going to be able to, it's just going to bring it up. It's something the user wouldn't find by themselves, but it is something that Copilot's going to find quite efficiently. Definitely Copilot and AI access to data in the organization. Then your typical regulatory stuff, your GDPR, NZ Privacy Act. There's various things that many organizations need to adhere to. Depending on the organization, the regulations obviously vary depending on where they are. So a financial institution has a different set of regulations to government. So it's aligning to all those regulations out there, making sure we have policies in place to protect that. And then your bigger picture of your data governance. I need to know what data do I have where, and how is that data being used in the organization.
Cool. Lots of different reasons to go forward with this kind of technology. And what are some of the foundational requirements a company needs to get started on this kind of data protection with Microsoft Purview journey?
Well, interesting with the sensitivity labeling is a lot of the work is done pre-implementation. So yes, you got the technical part where you're going to be going in and configuring all these policies and what labels do I want, and am I going to have encryption, am I going to restrict access, all those components you would configure, which is quite straightforward within the interface when you're doing it technically. A lot of the work comes in the background as an organization where you have to define your policies, define the types of data you have, who needs to use this data, in what way are they using it, what different classifications level are we going to have? Are we going to have a basic classification, or are we going to have sub-classifications? Are we going to do this by department? Are we going to do it as an organization? So that groundwork of what data do I have, how am I going to use it, who has access to it, that's where the majority of your work lies, because depending on the size of your organization, you could have 5 different departments, each having their own requirements on how they work with data. If I'm a person that's billing customers and I'm sending out invoices all the time, I'm going to have a different policy to someone that shouldn't be sending out bank account numbers and things that you would typically find on an invoice. So your organization's got to decide, am I going to restrict all my users from sending invoices, but except this department, or do I allow all users to do it? So you've got to start carefully going through all of these scenarios, preferably by each department, and building up your policy documentation that's going to say, this is what we're going to do in this instance for this type of user.
You and I were at the coalface when we went live with our data sensitivity labeling. We survived to tell the tale. What were some of the learnings you got out of it going live with Theta, and also the other customers that you've been working with?
So something we learned very quickly was we went forward and we did encryption on confidential documentation, and we said, fine, this is confidential, without too much forward thinking of what that use of that document is. And what we found was the minute we applied encryption and access control to a document, we couldn't send those documents out externally. Being a consultancy, we send a lot of information and we build lots of documentation for our customers. And the minute we added access control, which enforces encryption, people in our organization were trying to send documents out to our customers, and suddenly our customers are saying, I can't access this document. I'm getting error messages that I don't have permission. So we quickly learned we needed different types of confidential. So one being an internal one where we're going to encrypt the document, reduce access to it, and have all those lovely controls in place. But for our customers, we wanted to label it as confidential from a governance perspective. We wanted to put in watermarks and things like that on a document to say this is a confidential document, but minus the encryption, so that we could share that out to our different customers. So that jumped at us quite quickly.
Yeah, I recall that I think when we created the labels, we hadn't made it explicit enough what labels were going to be appropriate for customer-facing documentation versus internal. So I think, adjusting the labels to make it clear which ones were appropriate for customer use was one of those things we needed to be very agile with on day one.
And luckily, like I said, the technical side of it is actually pretty easy. To go and make that change in the background is go in, log in, make your changes, give it an hour, and it will replicate across your organization in most instances. So it's not a complex thing to change, but because we weren't clear on our policy in the beginning, it caused this bit of disruption in the organization. What we did was, because of the different options we have, we didn't want to force our users to use a particular label on certain documents. What we do is we just prompt them and we say, you need to apply a label on this document. We're not going to automatically do it for you. You know the document, you know the contents of this. So you are the one that's going to control what kind of labeling goes onto this document. And again, that helps us on an internal confidential document or a customer-facing confidential. They can go and choose that. We just ensure they do apply a label so that from a governance perspective, all the labels in our organization have been applied. And when we do something like Copilot and we restrict access, we can restrict Copilot from accessing a document even if it's not encrypted. It just looks at the label. It doesn't actually look at the content of the document.
I recall that some of our customers chose to auto-label their documents rather than letting the user decide because they didn't have as technical users. So I think that's one of those decision points for customers when they figure out, are they going to auto-label or are they going to enforce labeling as they go along?
Yeah, every organization is different, because what you would also find is if you're an organization and you've got a whole lot of history of documentation that you don't really use anymore, but you've kept it for historical purposes, the way this is going to work is you need to open a document to apply a label to it. So if it's just sitting in the background, it's archived off, no one's using it, you're not going to have labels applied to that. Then you're going to want to run a process that's going to go and auto-apply labels to those as well. So you can use a combination of the two as well if you want to, just making sure that anything archived, you're still going to have that labeling applied to it.
I know we also had a few issues with PDFs. Do you want to talk through some of those?
Yeah, so the thing with a PDF is when you start applying labeling to a Word document and you're saving it as a PDF, what's going to happen is anything that we apply to it through the labels policy is going to travel with that document. So if I put encryption on it and I say you're not allowed, or only these people can access the document, that'll travel with it even if you save it as a PDF. So you can't think of, I'm going to save it as a PDF and then I can share it. The minute you save it as a PDF, that encryption is going to follow it, and then it's going to still try and open up and verify the access to this PDF from a user perspective. And in order to do that, you can't just open the PDF with any tool that you want. We found that we needed to open it in Edge so that Edge can go and verify the access requirements through Purview. The other thing is you could use the ADF application, but then you needed to make sure that that was allowed within the organization and users could use that application as well. So if they've got a default Google Chrome and that opens a PDF in Google Chrome, they're going to get an error message, you can't open this. You need to open it with a tool that supports that, and not all tools support that verification.
Yeah, I still even today, even though we've been running with classification for quite a while, I still choose the print to PDF on my laptop in Word, but you have to now choose save to PDF to get the classification to work properly. So yeah, just some habits needed to change there. And I think we've still got that issue open where you can't read a classified PDF in Teams. I think Microsoft's got that as a feature enhancement request still.
That's on their roadmap. We've had many discussions with them about that as well, because it just doesn't make sense. You can't open a PDF in Teams. It doesn't verify it. So that is on their roadmap to sort that one out for us.
Yeah, I mean, at least it works when the PDF is downloaded, but yeah, it's just those nuances, which it seems to be quite a few with PDFs.
It changes your users' behavior. They're used to doing things one way. The more you disrupt them, the more reluctance you're going to get people using it and the more pushback. So you want to try and make sure that when you implement this, that it's done in a way that it doesn't completely change how a user does their day-to-day work.
Yeah, so least disruption as possible. So I think the other thing that was kind of interesting was that we had labels available for different parts of the business. So we had, labels for the board, the executive leadership team, for the legal team. Were there any learnings around that kind of configuration?
Yeah, I think we possibly went a bit far by doing too many for the departments, because what you'd find is when you're setting, so what you do when you set up a access control to a document, you use Entra ID groups, and that means we had to go in and create all of these additional groups and things like that. So the best is keep it as simple as possible. So even though we're saying do that prep work and that planning, still keep in your mind you want to keep this as a simple framework and make sure that your labels are clearly defined, people understand them correctly. You've done some sort of training beforehand and made people aware this is what you're going to use this particular label for. And the other route we did was we only expose certain labels to certain groups of people. So you're not, as a normal person in the organization, going to have 20 labels. You would have 5 to 6 labels you can use. And if I'm someone else in a different part of the organization that may require additional, those kind of labels only get exposed to that person. They don't get exposed to everyone.
And then I think, having that UAT environment to test how that interaction is going to work between the different teams is important as well.
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough that we've got a UAT tenant that we could use, where we went and tested all of this before we did it in our production environment. Understanding a lot of organizations won't have that. They won't have that extra tenant that they can use. So when we deploy to production, and even now, today, when we come up with new scenarios or policies, when we want to test that, because of licensing and that, sometimes we can't do it in our test environment or our UAT. What we do is we then create a control group. Like I said, you can create an intra-ID group that is restricted to a small group of people that are going to be your testers, and then you only deploy these policies to those people, let them work on it, test it, and once you configure it and everything's happy with it, then sort of roll it out to the rest of the organization. You don't want to implement a policy. We had a customer that did it, and I'm using that invoices again, where they send customers invoices. The labeling on it prevented customers from opening their invoices. So at the end of the month, when they had the invoice run, none of their customers could open their invoice to pay their bills. So, I mean, that's a massive impact. So those are the type of things you need to make sure you test in a control group before you start rolling it out to the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I think we had some learnings around third-party systems as well, around systems that had templated documentation in them or spat-out templated docs, and how that kind of reacted to the encryption.
Yeah. So that's something we weren't aware of. I didn't think we did all of our due diligence on each department to see who's using what and how it's going to impact it. So as part of your planning, you should have something in place in each department. And one of the big questions would be, do you use any third-party tools that interact with your Microsoft Office documents? Because if we had known that, we probably would have done more investigation. And the solution to that is just to pre-label those templates before they get worked on with sort of no access control. Otherwise, your third party can't authenticate itself. So what we had to do is ensure the templates are already labeled with a label that was open, but then the users, once it was generated the file for them, they can then go and change it to whichever kind of sensitivity label that they want.
Another couple of things that I recall we learnt during our testing, one was around co-authoring, and the other one was around being able to change the labels in documents.
Yeah, so the co-authoring is something we did pick up in the beginning as part of our planning. Depending on when your tenant has been sort of set up by Microsoft, there is a feature that you need to enable, which is the co-authoring, which means if I've got a label applied to a document and multiple users are working it, as we do as a consultancy, we share documents a lot. If you don't have that co-authoring feature enabled, it sort of locks it down, so only one user can work on the document at a time. That can have a massive impact. So enabling that co-authoring, and do it at least 24 hours, but I would give it at least 48 hours before you start thinking about any kind of labeling, just to make sure it's propagated through your system, because what it does is it changes the way all the metadata for a file is stored. So it's quite a big impact technically behind the scenes. It's not a big impact for anybody else, but it just allows us to be able to all work on the same documents at the same time with a label on it.
I recall that being able to change labels was a little bit contentious, because obviously if someone sets a label, they don't want someone else to be able to change it.
Yeah, so it does, technically you have got the fine grain where you can go in and say these users have a bit more rights than these to change labels. But if there is any point where you're lowering the sensitivity label to a different level, so I'm taking it from classified just to internal, you want to be able to record that, and users need to apply reasoning for that. They can't just go and do it and it's done. So we did put controls in place where people need to do that. And only certain groups can lower sort of what kind of classifications on a document.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Otherwise, we'll get everything set back to public.
Yeah, that's an easy way.
Yeah, I think really good advice around making sure that you're testing and understanding the different business scenarios. I think for me as well, making sure all of the users had good kind of pre-training, and making sure they were watching the training videos and reading the documentation so they understood the impact as well. I think, obviously you can never over communicate, and I think I was really pleased as a business how well we adopted it, and there were a few teething issues, but on the whole I think making sure everyone understood the change was really, really important too.
And I think after the deployment, it's being willing and ready to receive feedback immediately from users and have a plan that you can go in and make these little changes if you have to, if it's disrupting your organization, to be able to go in and quickly sort of, I wouldn't say roll it back, but just enable the capabilities that they want. But again, that comes down to that planning. If your planning's done thorough enough, you should have minimal sort of impact, but still be ready to be able to make those last minute changes to what you've configured in the policies. Yeah,
absolutely. So now we've got classified, labeled documents. It's great. What's next? What does the DLP look like? What comes after that?
So DLP, data loss prevention, is sort of another component under the Purview banner. But what that will do is that working with sensitivity labels, you can use DLP to ensure that certain labels aren't emailed out. If they're attached to an email, you can prevent them from going out, or you could prompt a user with a message saying, are you sure you want to send this? So you can put a bit more control with that data loss prevention capability. And that's also where you would implement the Copilot capability of, I don't want you to access this information. So if it sees a label, DLP's policy will be the one that's going to stop it from reading that. DLP, if configured incorrectly, can have quite a big impact. Like I say, emails not going out, I mean, that could be a big impact. It could affect your users and the business financially if you can't get the right communications out. So one of the key things and capability we got in there is to ensure you run it in a simulation mode that it provides. And what it does with the simulation mode is it allows you to see what is it going to do without actually doing it, so that it's not going to enforce it. It's just going to show you, look, we saw this happening. This is what we would have done. Are you happy with that? So you can go in and start sorting those out. If you do find a problem, you can get a ticket, or you can log a ticket internally and then work through that and say, this user experienced this, we need to start working around this. You can also allow users to give feedback without enforcing anything, saying, this email that you're sending contains this type of information. Do you want to send this? If you do, what's the reasoning? And that, just so you can get a better view on how users are working in the organization before you start enforcing it. Because the minute you enforce it, that's when you start seeing those restrictions and things not being able to go out.
Very good. Well, that was super interesting. I think there's lots of good lessons learned, and it wasn't too triggering going back and thinking about it all. I mean, as I said, I'm pretty happy with how it's going in the organisation and how well it's been adopted. So, yeah, bit of teething problems, but well worth it in the long run. We're in a much better position now. Anything else, Greg, that comes to mind before we close out?
No, just so I'm going to mention it a few times, is every organization's different. So when we're consulting with organizations around this, we don't go in with, this is what you must do. Each one's different. Each one works in a different way. So just keep in mind, when you're doing this planning and that, there's no fixed way to do it. There's like sort of recommendations and that, but each organization needs to define these policies in accordance to their organization and how they work as a business. And even though you can have two financial organizations, the way they do work could be different. They've got the same regulations, but the way their users work is different. So just make sure that all of those policies are aligned to that, and that you do thorough testing and UATs before you start rolling anything out to the larger organization.
Thank you very much for your time, Greg. That's been really informative. And thanks everyone for tuning into the Innovation Circuit. We'll see you next time.